Charles Dickens. Written by Jim Eldridge.
Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens was a writer who lived in England in the 1800s. He wrote over 20 novels, and in his books he created some very famous and well-known characters. He wrote about poor people, rich people, kind people, and wicked people. Many of the characters were based on people he had met while he was growing up. Charles Dickens was very interested in how people lived and how they behaved. He wrote about what life was like living in London at that time. The Dickens Family. Charles Dickens was born on the 7th of February 1812 in Portsmouth. Charles's father, John Dickens, was a clerk in the Navy Pay Office, and his job was to pay wages to sailors on board ships and also to the workers on the docks. The Dickens family moved many times because of John Dickens's job, usually to towns on the coast where the Navy ports were. Like many families at this time, Charles's parents had lots of children, and Charles had 7 brothers and sisters. In the 19th century, people didn't own houses unless they were very rich. They rented them instead. John Dickens earned enough money to rent a whole house for his family and have a maidservant live with them. In 1822, when Charles was 10 years old, John Dickens was transferred to London, and the family lived in a house in Camden Town. In the 19th century, Camden Town was a village outside London surrounded by fields. Charles's parents liked to have the best of everything: the best clothes, the best furniture, and the best food. If you didn't have much money, you ate food like potatoes, cheese, bread, and a thin porridge called gruel. If you did have money, you could pay for food like meat and fish. John Dickens and his wife Elizabeth spent more money than they earned. Sometimes they had to sell pieces of furniture to pay their food bills. When that wasn't enough, Charles's parents told him he had to start work to earn some money. In the early 19th century, most children worked if they were from poor families. Some small boys, as young as 5 years old, worked as chimney sweeps and climbed up the insides of chimneys to clean them. Others swept the streets. Many children worked in factories sewing sacks or making ropes. Children's jobs were hard and sometimes dangerous. Charles was not from a poor family, so he'd never worked before. Instead, he'd gone to school. But as he was the eldest boy in the family, he had to work now, so his parents found him a job in a shoe polish factory. He was only 12 years old. The shoe polish factory. The shoe polish factory, Warren's Blacking, was near the River Thames in London. For 6 days a week, Charles worked from 8 in the morning until 6 at night, sticking labels on pots of black shoe polish. The factory was a dark, dirty and crumbling building, and Charles hated the work. He described the factory as a crazy, tumble-down old house overrun with rats. Charles was paid 6 shillings a week. Today, this is only 30 pence. But at the time, this was enough money to buy food and pay for somewhere to sleep. Charles did not get to keep the money he earned. He had to give it all to his parents. As well as working for 10 hours a day, Charles walked 3 miles to and from the factory. Gas lamps lit the streets in the centre of London, but there was no lighting on the country roads between London and Camden Town. Charles started his job in the winter, so he had to walk in the dark. The roads were thick with mud when it rained, and slippery and frozen when it was cold. Prison. Only a few days after Charles started work at the shoe polish factory, his father, John Dickens, was arrested because he couldn't pay his bills. He was put in Marshalsea, a debtor's prison in Southwark, London. At that time, it was common for whole families to live in the prison until the money had been paid. This is what happened to the Dickens family. Marshalsea Prison was split into 2 different parts. One part was for criminals, and the other was for people like John Dickens, who owed money. In this part of the prison, there were 8 large houses, with a total of 56 rooms. The rooms were very small. John Dickens, his wife, and 6 of their children all had to live together in one of these rooms. There were lots of people in the prison, and it was a very crowded and dirty place. The main gates of the prison were locked from 10 at night until 8 in the morning. Half an hour before the gates were locked, an officer walked around the prison ringing a bell to tell visitors to leave. If a visitor didn't get out in time, they had to spend the night in prison. Prisoners were not locked in their rooms. They could walk around the prison whenever they wanted, and they had to do their own cooking and cleaning. Each inmate had to pay money to use the prison kitchen to boil water and cook meals. Charles didn't live in the prison. He earned enough money from working at the factory to pay to live in one small room in a lodging house in Camden Town. He also had to pay for food for his family while they were in prison. On Sundays, he went to the prison to see his family, but he did not like going there. He described the prison as slimy and rotten. Freedom, but not for Charles. After a couple of months, John Dickens inherited some money, and he paid his bills. Charles's parents couldn't afford to rent a whole house anymore, so when the family left prison, they moved into the same lodging house as Charles. Other people shared the house too, and the Dickens family lived in a few rooms. This was a much smaller space than they had lived in before, but bigger than the room at the prison. Charles, who'd had a room of his own, was now sharing with his parents and brothers and sisters. When John Dickens was sent to prison, he retired from his job. He was given a pension, but this was not enough money for the whole family to live on, so Charles had to keep working at the shoe polish factory. Charles didn't want to go back. When he was older, he wrote, "I can never forget or forgive that my mother made me go back to the blacking factory." School. When Charles was 13, he left the factory and went back to school. In the early 19th century, children didn't have to go to school. If you did go, you had to pay. John Dickens had some money left from his inheritance after he'd paid his bills, and he could now afford to send Charles to school again. John Dickens wanted Charles to be educated and become a gentleman, but Charles didn't like the school, and he thought the teaching was terrible. He described the head teacher as the most ignorant man I have ever known. There were over 200 boys at the school. They sat in rows on wooden benches with wooden desks. Paper was very expensive, so children used to write by scratching on a piece of slate. The teachers were very strict, and if a boy didn't behave, he could be hit with a stick. After 2 years, John Dickens ran out of money once more. Charles was 15 years old when he had to leave school again and go back to work. In Victorian schools, the classes were large and pupils sat in rows. Charles becomes a law clerk. Charles could read and write, so he got a job as a law clerk at a law firm in London. He had to copy out wills and take papers to and from other law firms in London and the law courts. Victorian law courts were busy and noisy. Charles walked everywhere, but in the 19th century, London was smelly, dirty and dangerous. The streets were always covered with horse dung from all the horse-drawn vehicles, and many people got knocked down by carriages. There was also the danger of smog. This was a mixture of smoke, which came from coal fires and factories, and fog. Londoners called smog a pea souper, because it was thick and green, like pea soup. Sometimes the smog was so thick even the light from the gas lamps couldn't be seen. Victorian London was a dirty and smelly place. Charles the writer. Charles wasn't interested in the law, but he was interested in the people he saw in court, the criminals and the victims of crime. When he was 18, Charles became a reporter. He went to the law courts and wrote about what happened there. When Charles was 21 years old, his first short story was published. He didn't get paid for it, but it helped to get him known as a writer. He also wrote for a newspaper about what London life was like. Charles wrote for a London newspaper called the Evening Chronicle. Charles's first full-length book was published in 1836 when he was 24 years old. This time he was paid £100. It would have taken Charles over 3.5 years to earn the same amount of money working as a law clerk, and he now had enough money to move out of the rooms he lived in with his parents and brothers and sisters and live on his own. Charles Dickens's family. In 1836, Charles married a young girl called Catherine. By this time, he was earning a lot of money as a writer, and he and his wife could afford to rent a whole house in a good area of London called Bloomsbury. Charles and Catherine had 10 children. With a large family to support, Charles needed most of the money he earned, but he always gave money to his parents, brothers and sisters. In the 19th century, there was no television or radio, and families entertained themselves by reading to one another or playing the piano and singing. Charles and Catherine had enough money to see plays at the theatre and go to music concerts. This was very different from Charles's life at the shoe polish factory. Travel. By 1841, Charles was a very famous writer, even though he was only 29. He had published many books, which had sold thousands of copies. His stories weren't just popular in Britain. American readers loved them too, so his American publishers invited him to tour the country, reading his stories to audiences. In January 1842, Charles and Catherine went to America. Aircraft had not been invented then, so it took a long time to get from Europe to America. Charles and Catherine's journey across the Atlantic was made in the small steamship Britannia, which took 17 days. It was rough for a large part of the journey. The seas in the Atlantic in January were wild and stormy, but it was worth it. Charles was one of the first English writers to travel to America on a reading tour, and he was a huge success. Charles went on many reading tours around Britain too, and he often went by train. In June 1865, the train he was travelling in crashed off the rails. Charles helped the injured passengers before others arrived. Just before he left the crash, he remembered he had left the manuscript of his latest book in the carriage and ran back to get it. Final days. Charles made his last public appearance on the 2nd of May, 1870, at a reading in London attended by the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII. On the 8th of June, Charles had a heart attack, and he died the next day. The book he was writing at the time was never finished. He was 58 years old. Charles was buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. This was a very special honour. Only the greatest writers like William Shakespeare are buried there. Charles Dickens today. Many people think that Charles Dickens is the greatest writer of stories who ever lived. Charles had been poor and he'd been rich, and when he wrote about what life was really like for people, especially children, in the 19th century, he was writing about his own life and the people he met. His books are still read today, 200 years later. Dickens's books have also inspired successful films, plays, and musicals.